One question that people sometimes ask is, can you throw a sword? Because you never know when you might need that skill in the office. So the short answer is, yes, you can. You can do a lot of things. You could also attach a bayonet to a rifle and throw that. Feel free to ask your nearest drill sergeant what he thinks about that. But in all seriousness, while it might seem silly to throw a sword, apparently it's not a new idea. In historical times, people must have at least occasionally considered or even attempted it, because it does appear in at least one historical sword fighting manual by the Italian master Fiore dei Liberi. He talks about throwing a sword, even shows the particular stance and grip from which you would do it. However, the way I read the text, it seems to me as if Fiore himself is not fond of this technique. He shows himself in a particular guard from which he says he is not worried about attacks like this. He can easily defeat them. And he seems to consider this something that a less experienced sword fighter would do. In fact, I think if you were to translate the text to modern everyday language, it would probably read something like, "You are noobs and I will pwn you." However, another passage mentions that different masters favor different things, and throwing a sword would be one of them. So apparently, at least some thought it was a good idea, others didn't. In any case, so this illustration shows the grip. The index finger is wrapped around the cross guard, and the flat of the blade is resting on the palm of the hand, and from here you would throw it like a spear, which is a very effective and intuitive way of doing it. I tried it myself without extensive practice, and yes, you can do it. It's fairly easy, and that's a good argument, because I cannot believe that they would practice sword throwing deliberately, you know, hours upon hours of regular practice. It's just not something you would normally do. It's more of a moment of opportunity kind of thing. And I cannot imagine that they deliberately practice that. So it needs to be something that you can pull off without having to dedicate a lot of practice to it. It was pretty easy for me to consistently hit the target and make it stick. And in fact, the throws seemed pretty powerful. The blade buried itself quite well in the archery target, which is quite tough. So it is an indication that if a throw like this connected, it could definitely be lethal, unless the target is heavily armored. Other people have tried throwing the sword in a different way, with 2 fingers on each side of the grip, or 1 finger on one side, 3 on the other, and then throwing from the side, which the picture does seem to suggest based on the stance. Although I don't think it's very conclusive, because from here you can easily move up and throw that way. So that doesn't necessarily say too much. However, one thing I found is if you throw directly from the side, it makes it more difficult, because you're more likely to give it lateral movement. So then the sword would kind of break out to the side. Another argument in favor of this kind of grip is that you can change the grip pretty quickly. So really all you need to do is rotate the guard around your thumb like this, and there you go. You're already in position. In fact, one of the instructors at Blood and Iron, the local HEMA club, for those who don't know, HEMA means Historical European Martial Arts, told me about a practitioner who actually pulled that off once in a tournament. His name was Stephen Fick, if I remember correctly, and he did just that. He rotated the sword in his hand and suddenly threw it at his opponent, which connected with the point against the mask, and then he just charged in with a gauntleted fist with a follow-up punch, and there you go, score. So you can, under certain circumstances, pull that off. However, I'd say it's quite a bit of a risk, because, well, obviously you're throwing your main weapon. If you have a sidearm, it's less of a problem, but it's a bit of a risk regardless. And also, it's a bit of an issue of distance, because if you are fairly close, your opponent, of course, has less time to react, because the sword is going to connect pretty soon. However, if they do manage to sidestep or parry or whatever, they are already pretty close, so they can step in fairly quickly while you're still fumbling for a sidearm or you know, otherwise trying to defend yourself, and then they can counterattack. So it's more of a risk at a short distance, but at a longer distance they will see it coming very easily, because obviously a sword you can't really throw at very high velocity, unless you're the Hulk or Thor or whoever, but normally it's not going to fly at a very high velocity. So it's pretty easy for them to see it coming, and when you do see a sword flying towards you, it's not that difficult to defend against. You could, for instance, simply wind up into the ox guard and block it that way, or you could simply deflect it to the side with a krumpau. So it's not particularly difficult to respond to. It's not even very difficult to catch it out of the air. In case of a sharp blade, you better have gloves, of course, and you can also simply just slap it aside with the flat of your hand. There are a few situations in which I'd say it would make perfect sense. For example, on a medieval battlefield or in some kind of fantasy setting or whatever, if you have swords lying around from less fortunate fighters, you could just pick one up and spot someone who has their back turned on you and just chug the thing and hope for the best. And that could work. And also, for example, if you have a crossbowman who's giving you funny looks and cocking his crossbow, and you have no cover, you just go, oh crap, and throw it to deal with that threat, or a bowman, or whatever else, you know, someone at a distance. So it would make sense under those conditions, and yeah, I suppose you can pull it off in an actual duel. Just seems a little more difficult that way. And just a few final remarks. I've seen at least one other person throw it from the side like this while deliberately twisting it to give it a spin as it's throwing. If it spins, it has more stability, of course, but I actually found that unnecessary. When I threw it like this, it always spun anyway, so you don't have to worry about that. And speaking of spinning, I also tried the full spinning throw, which I really did not expect to go very well, and it didn't. So that was well, you could say 1.5 rotations of the sword at that distance. Even when I did manage to hit it with the point first, it didn't even penetrate very far. It just flexed a lot and bounced right back. And I can tell that you're losing a lot of power when throwing this way, as opposed to the straight spear type throw. So I'd say Fiore's apparent skepticism is reasonable. Yes, you can pull it off, you can throw a sword effectively, and I'm certain that it would do sufficient damage. However, pulling it off in a duel would be pretty difficult. On a battlefield, most likely less so. And yeah, pretty much high risk, high reward maneuver potentially. So that's pretty much all I have to say about that. I hope you found this informative and entertaining, and thanks for watching. But of course, if you're throwing the whole sword, you're doing it wrong anyway, because if you want to end him rightly, you have to unscrew just the pommel and throw that.